Ways of taking advantage of free government handouts are becoming much harder. Recent changes in rules such as SNAP now requiring people to work or volunteer at least 20 hours a week to get the benefits. Low-income housing, which is known as HUD, is no different. There's been some major changes there that I only recently heard about. Will probably put a lot of people living on the streets. Yep, they're going to lose their housing. There's a lot of government programs that people definitely need to use, but then there's that are generational, that know how to manipulate the system and suck it for every dollar they can get. The administration imposed a 30% cap on funding for permanent supportive housing, often called Housing First, HUD, which provides long-term subsidized housing without mandatory work or treatment required. Stick with me. I'm going to jump more into details about this. Thank you for joining me. I'm Mary with Mary Greeley News. Thank you again for your support. Please like, share, and subscribe. HUD, as it's often called, ended automatic renewals for existing grants, putting current permanent housing tenants at risk if their providers lose funding in the new comprehensive program. Officials, including HUD Secretary Scott Turner, described this as a paradigm shift and long overdue reform to promote self-sufficiency, address root causes like addiction and mental illness, and what they called a failing housing first ideology that allegedly perpetrates dependency. They argue it restores accountability, aligns with President Trump's executive order on reducing street crime and encampments. Well, I think it's actually going to, raise those numbers. Critics, including housing advocates like the National Alliance to End Homelessness and some local officials, warn it could displace 170 to 200,000 people that are currently in stable permanent housing, many of them disabled, elderly, or veterans. By forcing programs to compete for reduced permanent slots or shift models. Here in South Dakota, they definitely have a shortage of apartments you can rent. Sioux Falls, as an example, they have a waiting list for HUD housing that is probably over 4 years in waiting there. Rapid City, Pennington County, they have a waiting list of up to 4 years, maybe even longer. Smaller towns in rural areas here in South Dakota where, getting a good paying job or a living wage is hard to find, such as Aberdeen, Watertown, Mitchell, Pierre. You may have to wait up to a year or longer. Preferences can shorten your wait time, such as if you're already living on the streets, domestic violence, disability, or if you're a veteran who's homeless. Or being elderly supposedly can move you up to the front of the list. Now, South Dakota has a low population and it's relatively low in demand compared to many states. So wait times are generally shorter than in urban coastal areas. This new rule slashes funding for Housing First or HUD programs by more than half nationally, from 87% of the $3.9 billion pot to a maximum of $1.2 billion. Existing Housing First projects must now compete for a much smaller slice. Many will lose funding entirely. Transitional temporary housing is going to be slashed up to 2 years. Those in the programs now are going to be required to work or treatment or self-sufficiency plans. The changes apply to grants that fund housing and services primarily for the calendar year 2026. Many existing grants expire between January and December of this coming year. Those that will lose their funding as of January of this year potentially is going to lead to gaps in funding and tenant displacements during the winter months. There's an application deadline for these states. Communities and providers must submit applications under these new restrictions by January 14th of the coming year, 2026. Didn't give them much time to try and figure out what they're going to do. HUD published the NOFO on November 13th of this year, late evening, Thursday night, in some reports. This immediately set the new rules for the current fiscal year 2025 and 2026 funding competition cycle. So just exactly what is Housing First? HUD. Housing First is a evidence-based approach that provides permanent subsidized housing to people experiencing homelessness without preconditions, like sobriety, employment, or mandatory treatment for mental illness. In the past, once they were housed, voluntary supportive services such as mental health, addiction treatment, job help were offered, but it wasn't mandatory. That had been the core strategy of HUD's programs for over a decade, backed by decades of research showing high success rates, 80 to 90% housing retention, and cost saving compared to shelters or streets. Think about all the children. So these new rules make it where no continuum of care can allocate more than 30% of its COC award to permanent housing projects. It slashes funding for Housing First programs, HUD, by more than half nationally. They have to share the pot, which is $1.2 billion. The administration and supporters of these new rules argue that some able-bodied people or non-chronically homeless individuals have gamed the system by staying in permanent supportive housing long-term without mandatory treatment for substance abuse or mental illness. Sometimes they refuse voluntary services while relying on subsidies indefinitely. It also contributed to permanent visible homelessness in cities, such as encampments, because low barrier Housing First allegedly enabled ongoing drug use or inactivity, refusing to work. HUD Secretary Scott Turner and officials have called the prior system a self-sustaining slush fund that perpetrated dependence rather than promoting accountability and self-sufficiency. I personally do know people, I talked about one group of people that I'd actually had given food to, which I regretted doing later. They're drug and alcoholics that flat out refuse to go to treatment centers. It's going to shift them to transitional and temporary housing. The maximum that they can take advantage of the system is 2 years. Yeah, they have, I believe it's a 3-bedroom apartment. The funding will now prioritize programs that could include requirements for work, job training, mandatory substance abuse, and mental health treatment. People seen as taking advantage of the system, such as able-bodied adults not engaging in services, trying to get help, looking for work, will likely be pushed into time-limited housing. If they don't comply with the new rules, treatment mandates, they risk losing assistance altogether and returning to shelters, streets, or encampments. Like I said, it's gonna, some of these people, they are able-bodied, but they love the drugs or the alcohol more than their own life themselves. Communities get bonus points funding for participating in law enforcement to remove tents and direct people into these more structured, often mandatory treatment programs. I was wondering about this surge in hiring park police for San Francisco Bay Area, if that had anything to do with it. The San Francisco Chronicle had an article about the National Park Service announcement, their plans last week that they said to hire up to 500 experienced law enforcement officers, including 300 U.S. Park Police positions across Washington, D.C., New York City, and San Francisco. They're also going to hire 200 law enforcement rangers throughout the country. I've talked about how here in South Dakota, being homeless is not allowed. No tents are allowed here in South Dakota. But recently, yeah, the police have been kind of like looking the other way. Yeah, the laws had not been enforced within, the last year. But no one wants to be living on the streets in a tent or in a car when winter hits. Sometimes we have weather that is colder here than what they have in Alaska. I have seen wind chills of up to 50 below zero here in South Dakota. From the administrative perspective, they say it's going to force people to get clean, get jobs, or become independent, reducing long-term reliance on taxpayer-funded housing. But many in this category, especially those with untreated addiction or who prefer no mandates, may refuse the new treatments and end up back on the streets. Traditional housing has historically higher failure rates. People often return to homelessness after a limited time. And critics say this will increase visible homelessness and costs, like people going to the ER or jails, things like that. In short, if someone was in permanent housing first, HUD housing, primarily because it had no rules, requirements, and they weren't motivated to change, this policy will make their housing much less secure starting in 2026, likely forcing compliance, a time limit, or exit from the federally funded system. And the changes don't grandfather existing tenants. Many programs risk defunding entirely if they don't adapt. So, what are your thoughts? I think this will increase crime. I'm definitely going to make sure my doors are locked, keep my head on a swivel. Like I said, I did try and help the one family, and I wish I never did that. Please put your comments down below. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll talk to you later. God bless you.